Add an unexpected twist to your quilting by using the designs to create secondary patterns in the background areas of your quilts. Hi everybody, it's me, Angela Walters from quiltingismytherapy.com, and welcome to the last video in the Negative Spaces Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along video series. Throughout the previous videos, we've been learning different ways to quilt background areas of our quilts, including adding movement and changing up the scale of our designs. If you haven't watched the previous videos in this series, be sure to go back and check them out. And it's not too late to quilt along with me on the custom panel I designed for this video series. It's the perfect way to give you the experience of quilting along on a quilt without taking the time or effort to make the quilt top. To learn more about the exclusive products or to check out the previous videos in the series, be sure to click the link in the description box below or visit quiltingismytherapy.com. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can use your quilting to create secondary designs in the background areas of your quilts. I'll share how I use the piecing as a guide to create those secondary patterns. We'll learn how to break up larger background areas to make them more manageable, and how to use this technique to fill in irregularly shaped background areas as well. When we're done, you'll be inspired to try this technique on your quilts. I'm also going to show you how to quilt it on a sewing machine and a Longarm, and I'm going to tell you how to get some free quilting diagrams at the end. Now, I will admit that this technique is a little abstract because every quilt that we work on will be a little bit different, but I promise it's worth learning. So let's get to it. Since every quilt pattern is different, I can't give you a set number of steps to follow to recreate those secondary patterns. But that's a good thing because you can use your imagination and your skills to create your very own secondary patterns on your quilt. But I'm not going to leave you hanging. I do have a few things that I look for when I'm trying to make those patterns. First, I love to look to the blocks themselves for piecing inspiration. I love to look at the blocks and imagine where the lines would go if they were to extend from the points or the corners. What would happen if they changed direction or ran into another block? Believe me, I have stood at a quilt many a time tracing along trying to imagine where those lines would go. In this example, I quilted the lines so they extend from the star, but change direction once they hit that next fabric. Then I thought, well shoot, I should probably do the same on the other side. And just for fun, I added a few lines in that direction. And then echoing them around them a couple times to really help build them up and show off that secondary pattern. And then I filled in all the areas with different designs. Those lines are going to be what creates that secondary pattern, but they're also going to be the things that break up that negative space into more manageable chunks. Now this example is the same panel, just quilted slightly differently. Instead, this time I imagine the lines came from this side and echoed their way back over here. Then I did the same thing on the other side, just quilting them so they extended out to here. Like I've already said, not only does this give some interest to those background areas, but it might be actually easier to quilt because you're dealing with little sections as opposed to the whole thing. Now, let's take a look at the unquilted panel and maybe make a little game plan for how we can quilt it. I can start to imagine where those lines might go. For longer lines or more complex patterns, I like to go ahead and at least mark out some guidelines. Normally, I like to mark with my water-soluble pen, but on these darker fabrics, I'm going to use a chalk pencil. For this example, I'm going to imagine that the lines are coming out of the sides of the block instead of the points. I'm going to use a long ruler to kind of help me mark out those lines. I kind of love how the line's going to look like it's going behind that block, kind of giving it that secondary pattern. One thing I definitely consider when deciding how to place all these lines is my throat space. I don't like to quilt really long lines over the whole quilt. I kind of struggle with that. So I prefer to break them up and have them go in different directions. Not only because it gives me a good stopping point, but it helps me have a little bit more control and shorter lines. So in this example, I could quilt that line so it comes all the way down to the edge. I think that would look cool. And I could echo both sides and then fill in the rest of the area. But if I wanted to keep the lines a little shorter or give it a slightly different look, I could have it change direction once it hits this part of the panel. Or I could have it change direction at any point and then make a couple like stair steps with the quilting. I think the trick is just knowing what you like to quilt and making the designs kind of fit within that. Now since I love how this is looking, I'm actually going to widen it up a little bit and have it quilt something like this, creating almost a sashing that I can fill in. Or I could quilt the line from here and echo on both sides, and it would look less like a sashing, but also be thinner and a little bit easier to quilt. But we know I love to keep it symmetrical, so whatever I do on this side of the star, I'm going to do on that side of the star as well. Now, of course, we don't have to actually look to the blocks for those lines. I can put lines anywhere I want to create those secondary patterns. I mean, this is the time just to kind of like have fun with it, especially in this marking phase, because you can always remove them if you're not liking how it's looking. I mean, I could quilt some lines that look like they're going behind my quilting, or I can just kind of quilt the sides of a square so it kind of juts out from the side of the quilt. It's like a choose your own quilting adventure. Now that we kind of have a game plan for our quilting, let's take this to a sewing machine and see what it looks like. I'm going to start by quilting along my guidelines. Then I'm going to use traveling along the edge to quilt my next line. And I'm using a ruler to help me keep those lines somewhat straight-ish. But if you don't have a ruler or you don't want to do that, you can just freehand those lines. And as I'm working my way around the quilt, I have a couple of choices. I could go ahead and fill in this area now while I'm here, or continue on and mark all my guidelines out and then fill them in. It really just kind of depends on how you prefer to work your way through the quilt. Some people find it a lot more helpful to have all those lines quilted and then fill in, and others like me are fine with just winging it as I go. As I'm quilting these longer lines, I'm using the reference points on my ruler to help keep them somewhat straight. And if I wanted, I could continue quilting the other sections of the star by using the traveling along the edge to get to those points, and quilting those lines and moving on. But once I have my sections quilted, then it's time to decide, do I want to add some echoing or not? You could echo inside that shape or outside the shape. It really just depends on what you're working with. But since this is a little bit wider, I'm going to use echoing along the inside by traveling along the edge and echoing those lines. And just like the other quilting designs we've seen, you can go about how you quilt this a little bit differently. In this example, I quilted the outside lines first and then I'm echoing, but I could have quilted my one outside line and echoed and then did the same on the other side. Now, even though this is the free motion challenge quilting along and I'm encouraging you to do some free motion quilting, you could always use your walking foot to create those straight lines and then come back and use your free motion quilting to fill them in. I want you to do whatever you'll feel comfortable doing so that you can enjoy the technique. Now that I've echoed it a couple times, I'm going to fill in the rest of the area with a different design. Since this almost looks like a sashing on a quilt and it's about 2 inches or so in width, I think I'm going to use the wishbone design. I just like the wishbone design because it's nice and quick to quilt and it takes me from one side of the area and helps me end on the opposite side. Of course, if you don't like the wishbone design, you can do a totally different design in this area, going with some back and forth lines or even a meandering line that fills it in. If you're not sure how to quilt the wishbone design and you're thinking you might want to learn how, check out my free motion fillers quilting along video series. Once I fill that in, it's time to move on and continue filling in my areas. Now I'm going to echo my way around the outside to help get me to the next section so I can fill it in. So I'm going to echo down along this line. Then I'm going to echo along the other side and fill in the area just like I did the first one. Then once that's filled in, I'm going to echo along to the other side and repeat. In this example, I'm using the echoing to help me maneuver my way around the area, but it's also going to help separate the rest of the quilting from the filler, helping to show off those secondary patterns. And as I'm working my way around that block, at any point I find myself touching it, I like to go ahead and transition and fill in that block while I'm there, and then return back and continue on. Doing that helps me work through my area a little bit more efficiently. But of course, you know by now that you can go about it differently. You can do all your blocks first and then come back into your background areas, or do it just like I'm showing here. And once I have that finished, then I can start filling in those background areas. I think I'm going to quilt a flower meander in this area just because it has a nice softer look. The flower meander is kind of similar to that wavy swirl we learned in the earlier video, except in this example, I'm quilting my curl, then quilting arcs that extend out from around it. Then once I run out of room, I'm going to add my next row of those arcs. Once I'm ready to add my next flower, I'm going to quilt another little line that curls out and continue quilting those arcs. I'm trying to quilt all these arcs so that they're the same size. That's going to give me this nice all over kind of consistent texture. Now as I'm filling in this background area, I'm using a contrasting thread so that you can see what the quilting looks like on camera. But using a thread color that blends in with the background area is really going to help you see the beautiful texture of the quilting without seeing every bump and bobble. And as you're filling in that area with those flowers, you can quilt partial rows of arcs to fill in any irregular areas, especially in between some of those flowers. The most important thing here is that the whole thing is filled in as completely as possible. And as we're filling in this area that's around our secondary quilting patterns, we can almost treat the individual sections like their own little bit of negative space. So the techniques that we've learned in previous videos will be perfect for this area. Whether it's using wavy lines to add movement, or changing up the scale of the design to highlight the block, or creating even more secondary patterns within that area. While it's totally fine to use the same filler in all those background sections, I like to change it up as I go, probably because I find it less boring than quilting the same design in all the areas. In this area, I'm quilting that wavy design that we learned in a previous video in this series. However, I'm quilting a lot more densely by making those lines nice and close to each other. It's going to take a little bit longer to quilt this, but it's really going to make that secondary pattern pop out. If you haven't already seen that video tutorial, be sure to check it out because I show you how to do this design in more detail. But truly, there's no wrong way to go about doing this. Just play around, use the designs that you like best, and when you're done, you're going to step back and see your beautiful quilting. Now that we've kind of seen this on a sewing machine, let me show you what it looks like to do it on the Longarm. Quilting secondary designs is pretty much the same on the Longarm as it is a sewing machine. One main difference is how I approach the quilt. I have to start at the top of the quilt and work my way down. To keep the quilting efficient, I like to ensure that all the lines are going to fit within my throat space. That just means I don't have to advance back and forth as I'm quilting. To make that happen, sometimes I'll quilt the lines so they change direction or maybe run into other blocks. But just like we saw on the sewing machine, once I've kind of created my guidelines, I'm going to start filling in those areas, using echoing to kind of help build up those areas I want to show off, and then filling in the rest of the areas with some different filler designs. And as you're filling in the rest of that background area, you can try all sorts of fillers. You can quilt the same one in all the sections or use different ones in each section. You can use fillers that are quick and comfortable for you to quilt, or you can try ones that you might find a little bit more difficult. Since none of these areas are huge, you're not committing to quilting a new design over a whole area, and that can kind of make it less daunting. But like I've said, you can make this technique as basic or as complex as you like. So play around with it and see what kind of designs you can come up with on your quilts. Another way that I like to create those secondary patterns is to look inside the block, taking some of those designs and quilting them out in the background areas. For instance, looking at this quilted panel, I could kind of zoom in on the smaller star block and use it as inspiration for that background area by taking that same shape and just quilting it in different parts to add that interest. But I also love to use this idea to build up more basic blocks and to make them look bigger and more beautiful. So looking to this same star, it's actually the same shape that's inside this bigger block right here. And as I looked to the piecing on the block, I realized, you know what, I could quilt this kind of next row around this block. And I'm going to show you what that looks like on the Longarm quilting machine. And as usual, I'm using a ruler when quilting these straight lines, especially on a Longarm. Not only does it help me keep those lines straight-ish, but it definitely helps me with those diagonal lines, which I find tricky to quilt without it. So if you're quilting along with me on a Longarm quilting machine, I'd highly suggest using a ruler for these areas. Not only does it help those lines look better, but the reference marks on them help ensure that the design stays straight. If this were a more complex block, I probably would go ahead and mark it out before starting. But since this one is a little smaller, I'm just going to use the reference marks on my ruler as a guide to help me quilt it out. And here's what it looks like all finished. There's my smaller star, using the quilting to kind of build up that piecing. I love how it kind of builds it up, but also kind of reinforces the main block of the panel. Then, once that whole thing is finished, I can fill in the rest of the background area. While this technique won't work on every block, especially ones that are bigger and more complex, it's definitely one to keep handy. Now this quilt is another example of using the quilting to recreate the piecing. To help highlight the block in the center, I used the quilting to recreate some piecing in that background area. By quilting arched lines that came out, and then using echoing and quilting them like they were an actual block. It's so great because the block is already there, all I have to do is look to it for design inspiration. Sometimes creating those secondary patterns is as easy as connecting points on your quilt. Look to the borders, look to the blocks, and look to other quilting designs to see if you can connect them with the quilting. For instance, in this border area, even though it's a panel, it's supposed to look as though it's pieced. I realized I could just quilt a line from one side to the other, just kind of connecting those. Not only is it easy because those points are right there, but it kind of just adds that secondary pattern to the background area. And like we've already said, you can make this as basic as you want and quilt just one line, or keep going with it, connecting those lines and creating more complex looking secondary designs. Let me show you what that looks like. So in this example, I would decide to quilt the lines to connect the pieces in the border, then echo the space inside them to build them up and help separate them from the rest of the quilting. I just love that the piecing is already there. All I have to do is connect the dots. And as you try this technique on your quilts, try different filler designs in these areas. You could try wishbones, back and forth lines, or just stick with some nice basic echo lines. And what's amazing is the more you do this, the more you'll start seeing points on your quilt that you can connect to create some designs. And one last suggestion as you're plotting out your secondary designs is to let the quilting evolve. There is nothing wrong with wanting to have a plan, but I know sometimes quilters feel like we need to know exactly what it's going to look like before we get started. But don't be afraid to let the quilting evolve. Sometimes my best quilting ideas come after I've already started the quilt. I know it's easy for me to say, but you don't have to know what the whole thing's going to look like before you get started. Just jump on in and start using your imagination, knowing that once you're finished, that whole area is going to be filled in as beautifully as possible. So while it is an abstract kind of technique, creating secondary patterns in the background areas of your quilt can actually be pretty easy once you get started. So what do you think? Does this sound like a technique that you might like to use on your quilts? If so, let me know in the comment section below. If you're quilting along with me on the custom panel I designed for the video series, go ahead and finish quilting it by filling in the areas highlighted in red. Try the examples we've learned in this video, or come up with your own secondary designs. And once you're finished quilting your panel, I hope you'll step back and be proud of how far you've come and just how much we've learned over these videos. And as always, I put together those free quilting diagrams and tip sheet. And if you want a little bit more help, a little bit more design inspiration, you can check out the expanded resource PDF with even more quilting designs and even more samples. To find out more about those, you can just click the link in the description box below or visit quiltingismytherapy.com. While this wraps up the Negative Spaces Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along video series, I will be back soon with another video with design ideas for quilting the optional borders for our panel. Until then, everybody, happy quilting.